If you've ever wondered when your place in someone's life quietly disappeared, you probably didn't notice it all at once. I didn't either. My father's apartment is on the 6th floor of a pre-war building on the Upper West Side. The elevator still has the original brass gate. The hallway smells like old wood and radiator heat, the same smell it's had since I was a child pulling off my snow boots at the door. I've been walking that hallway for 49 years. I knew every crack in the plaster, every neighbor by name. I knew which step on the staircase groaned if you stood on the left side. That building wasn't real estate to me. It was the place my mother came home from the hospital holding my baby sister. It was where my father taught me to read a blueprint on the kitchen table. It was the address I still wrote on emergency contact forms, even after I had my own apartment, because somewhere in my mind it remained the place I was from. When I turned 21, my father pressed a brass key into my hand. He smiled the way he smiled when he was proud of something, quietly, like he didn't want to make a fuss of it. He said, "As long as you have this key, you'll always have a home here." I kept it on my keyring for 28 years. It was a Tuesday in October when I went for my usual visit. I had a canvas bag with groceries, his preferred brand of soup, the crackers his doctor had approved, some decaf he'd asked for the week before. I had a notepad where I'd written down his afternoon medication schedule because he sometimes got confused about whether he'd taken the second pill. I wasn't there to check on him the way someone checks on a stranger. I was there the way you show up for the person who raised you. I put the key in the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, gently, the way you do when you think maybe you've made a mistake. It didn't turn. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the key, not quite understanding. I knocked, footsteps. Then the door opened, but not all the way. Vanessa. She was wearing a cream-colored cardigan and small gold earrings. Her hair was neat. She looked exactly like someone who had just been complimented on how calm she seemed under pressure. "Monica." She smiled, warm as a greeting card. "You didn't call ahead." I told her I hadn't called ahead in 20 years because I had a key. She tilted her head, sympathetic, the way you do when you're about to explain something to someone who simply doesn't understand yet. "We had to change the locks," she said, "for your father's safety. There was a situation with the building, someone in the stairwell. It just made sense to update everything." She said it so easily. Like it hadn't occurred to her that updating everything would include updating me out of my own father's front door. Before I could answer, I heard him. "Monica?" My father appeared behind her, and for one moment he was completely himself, eyes clear, voice warm, the particular way he said my name that he'd had since I was small. I reached past the half-open door to touch his hand. And then the confusion moved across his face the way weather moves, one moment sun, then cloud. He looked at Vanessa. She put her hand on his arm, gently, guiding. "Richard, why don't you go sit down? I'll bring your tea." He nodded. He went. The door stayed half open and I was on the wrong side of it. The visit lasted 11 minutes. I stood in the hallway. Vanessa stood in the doorway. We spoke the way people speak when one of them is being careful and the other hasn't figured out why yet. She told me my father had been tired lately, that the routine mattered, that too much stimulation wasn't good for him right now. Every sentence was reasonable on its own. Put them together and they formed a wall. I told her I understood. I told her I'd call before coming next time. She said that would be easier for everyone. She smiled again, closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my canvas bag and my useless key, and I told myself not to make it into more than it was. My father was 82. He had dementia. He needed consistency. She was there every day. I wasn't. The locks were changed for safety. These were all reasonable things. I told myself those things all the way to the elevator. I told myself those things on the walk home. I almost believed them. The superintendent was coming out of the utility room when I passed him in the lobby. Older man. He'd worked the building since before my sister was born. He looked at the key in my hand. He looked at me. He said, quietly, like he didn't want anyone to hear, "I thought you had a key." There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the dependable one. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, the exhaustion of doing too much quietly for so long that people stopped noticing it entirely. That was me. My mother died when I was 27. The grief hit my father in a way I hadn't expected, not loudly but sideways. He'd reach for the phone to tell her something and stop. He'd make 2 cups of coffee out of habit and then stand there looking at the second one. I started coming more often, not because anyone asked, because someone needed to, and I was there. I handled the paperwork after she died. The accounts, the insurance, the letters from organizations that didn't know yet. I sat with him through the first Thanksgiving, the first Christmas. The first ordinary Tuesday that felt impossible for no reason anyone could name. When my sister died 12 years later, I made him the same quiet promise I'd made myself. He would not face old age alone. I meant it. I still mean it. Vanessa came into his life about 2 years after his diagnosis, a widow from his church, soft-spoken, organized. She brought food. She remembered which medications needed to be taken with a full glass of water. She sent birthday cards to people she'd only met twice. I was grateful. I told her so. She smiled and said, "He deserves to be looked after properly." I agreed with her. I didn't hear what was underneath that sentence yet. The changes happened slowly enough that I kept finding reasons for each one individually. My father began missing my calls. Vanessa said he napped in the afternoons now, and I'd been calling at the wrong time. I adjusted. A visit I'd scheduled got cancelled. Richard wasn't feeling well. The next one too. A doctor's appointment had run long. The one after that, Vanessa thought the week had been too tiring. I rescheduled. Every time. I told myself I was being flexible, respectful of his needs. I worked long shifts at the hospital. I knew what real exhaustion looked like. I wasn't going to add to his. But somewhere in the adjusting and rescheduling, I'd stopped arriving unannounced, stopped trusting my own instincts about when he needed me, started asking permission to see my own father. I didn't notice that happening. That's the thing I keep returning to. I didn't notice. I ran into one of my father's neighbors at the cafe near his building one morning. Eleanor. She'd lived 2 floors above him for over a decade. We used to exchange pleasantries in the elevator, chat at the occasional building gathering. She was warm when she saw me, touched my arm. "It's so good to see you out and about," she said. I wasn't sure what she meant. Then she said, "Vanessa mentioned you'd stopped coming around as much. I figured you must be going through something." I told her I came every week. She looked at me with a kind of careful expression. The look people have when they don't want to contradict you, but aren't sure they believe you either. She said she was glad to hear it. We parted warmly. I sat in my car for 10 minutes afterward. Vanessa had been telling people I wasn't coming. Not that visits were difficult to schedule, not that my father's routine was demanding. She'd been telling people I had stopped. I turned the sentence over and over, trying to find a generous interpretation. I couldn't find one. I still carried the brass key. I knew it didn't work anymore. I'd tried it twice more after that Tuesday in October, just to confirm what I already understood. It didn't open anything. But I kept it in my purse, in the small interior pocket I never used for anything else. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because taking it off my keyring felt like agreeing to something I hadn't agreed to. Maybe because it still felt like a door, even if it no longer opened one. At the hospital, I work with families going through the worst days of their lives. I know what it looks like when someone is genuinely being cared for, and I know what it looks like when someone is being managed. I'd started to understand, somewhere beneath the part of me that still wanted to believe in reasonable explanations, that my father was being managed. And I was too. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, forwarded from my father's address to mine, which was odd in itself since I hadn't updated anyone with my mailing address in years. It was from an attorney's office I didn't recognize. Inside were several pages of documents related to a family trust, restructuring of assets, the cover letter said, standard planning given Richard's age and health. There was a notepaper clipped to the signature page. Delay in signing may interrupt the continuity of Richard's medical care arrangements. That was the entire sentence. No explanation of what continuity meant, no phone number to call with questions, no name I recognized. Just that sentence, sitting there like a door I was being told to walk through without being allowed to see what was on the other side. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown. Clean carpet, a window facing west. The kind of office that's designed to feel reassuring. Neutral colors, framed credentials, a small dish of wrapped mints on the conference table, as though sweetness might ease whatever you came there to do. I sat across from a man I had never met before that afternoon. He explained that Richard's original estate planning needed to be updated. That given Richard's age and the progression of his condition, it was important to have proper structures in place. That the family trust, as currently written, had gaps that could create complications. I asked who had referred him. He said Vanessa had recommended the firm because Richard's longtime attorney had retired. I asked if I could take the documents home to review them. He said that was certainly my right, but that Richard's current care arrangement was connected to the financial framework being established, and any disruption in the paperwork timeline could affect continuity of service. That phrase again, continuity of service. I thought about my father. About the memory care clinic where he now spent 3 afternoons a week, the one with the garden he liked, the staff member who remembered he preferred Earl Grey. I thought about what it would mean if something administrative interrupted that. I signed. I signed because I was afraid of what wouldn't happen if I didn't. I didn't understand then that fear is exactly the environment that kind of paperwork is designed to grow in. There were good days still. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. Some afternoons I would sit with my father in the clinic's small common room, and he would be entirely himself. He'd ask about my work, tell me a story I'd heard 20 times and make me laugh with it again anyway. Reach over and pat my hand the way he had since I was small. On those days, I believed we still had time. Then there were the other days. He looked at me once, carefully, the way you look at someone you're trying to place, and said, "You look like someone I used to know." I told him it was me, Monica, his daughter. He nodded slowly, politely, the way you nod when you don't want to contradict someone. I excused myself to the hallway before my face could do something I didn't want him to see. Dementia is a particular kind of grief because you lose someone while they're still there. You learn to hold 2 truths at once, that he is here and that parts of him have already gone somewhere you can't follow. What I hadn't prepared for was the third thing. The possibility that someone was standing between us during whatever time remained, quietly narrowing the window. Vanessa was always present on the days I visited the clinic, always nearby, always the one who knew which chair he preferred, which topic settled him, which staff member he trusted. She had made herself indispensable in a way I couldn't argue with, because who argues with indispensable? My father died on a Tuesday morning in February. The clinic called me at 6:47. He had gone peacefully, they said, in his sleep. Vanessa had been there the night before. I had visited 2 days earlier. He had been tired but calm. He held my hand. Near the end of our time together, he looked at me clearly, fully present, no confusion, and said, "You'll take care of everything, won't you?" It wasn't quite a question. I said yes, of course I would. He closed his eyes. Of course I would. He closed his eyes. I sat beside him for another hour before his breathing changed into sleep. That was the last conversation we had. After the funeral, I came home to my apartment and placed the brass key in the drawer of my bedside table. I couldn't look at it anymore, not because it reminded me of losing him, though it did, but because of what it had already become before he died. What it had been turned into without my permission. A symbol of access revoked, a door that no longer recognized me. I closed the drawer. I thought I was grieving. I was, but that wasn't all I was doing. 6 weeks after the funeral, my father's estate attorney, not the man from the Midtown office, but someone different, someone I'd reached out to on my own because something in me refused to stop asking questions, called and asked if we could meet. He'd been reviewing the documents on file. He was careful with his words, measured. The way people are when they want to make sure you're seated before they tell you something. He said, "There's another version of your father's estate plan. There is a particular kind of anger that arrives quietly, not the kind that makes you raise your voice, the kind that settles somewhere behind your sternum and makes you very, very still." That's where I was when I walked into the estate attorney's office the second time. Grief had done what grief does, hollowed me out, then slowly filled the space with something harder. I was ready to understand what had actually happened. The attorney's name was Gerald, older man. He'd been practicing for 30 years and had the kind of careful manner that comes from having delivered unwelcome news to enough families to know it should be done slowly. He walked me through the documents. Richard's original will, dated 2007, named Monica and her late sister as equal beneficiaries of the estate, the apartment, the accounts, everything. A subsequent trust, executed in the final 18 months of Richard's life, redirected the majority of those assets. New structures, new names. Vanessa's interests protected throughout, her son listed as a secondary beneficiary under the guise of caregiving compensation. Gerald set a financial summary on the table between us. Large transfers, tens of thousands of dollars, had been moved out of Richard's personal accounts during the same period, each one labeled as a caregiving expense. He said, "I want you to understand the timeline." He placed Richard's medical records beside the financial records. The dates aligned in a way that left very little room for interpretation. The most significant estate changes, the trust restructuring, the signature pages, the transfers, had all occurred during periods when Richard's cognitive assessments showed the steepest decline. Not before, during. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked about the building. The superintendent's name was Frank. He'd worked that building for 22 years. He wasn't someone who volunteered information, but when I asked him directly whether he'd kept any record of visitor access over the past 2 years, he went quiet in a way that told me he'd been waiting for someone to ask. The building had installed a digital entry log 18 months earlier. He pulled it up on his computer without another word. My name appeared regularly. Weekly, sometimes twice a week. Timestamps. Entry attempts, most of them marked as unsuccessful. The period after the locks had been changed, several were marked as denied by the intercom system. There were also entries where I had reached the building and been turned away. No record of those in any official capacity. Just the timestamps that told me I had been there on the same dates Vanessa had apparently been telling neighbors I never came. I asked Frank if anyone had ever said anything to him about my visits. He looked at the screen instead of at me. He said, "She told a few of us you'd basically stepped back, that you were dealing with your own things, that your dad understood." He paused. I figured it wasn't my business. Sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't what someone takes from you, it's what they convince everyone else to believe about you. She hadn't just changed the locks, she had changed the story. Neighbor by neighbor, building staff by building staff, church friend by church friend. She had been quietly constructing a version of me that didn't show up. That had chosen her own life over an aging father. That had made Vanessa's presence not just helpful, but necessary. By the time I understood what was happening, the portrait was nearly complete, and my father had been surrounded by people who believed it. Back in Gerald's office, he asked me a question I hadn't expected. He asked whether I still had my original apartment key. I reached into my purse. Interior pocket, where I had been carrying it for months, through the lock change, through the signatures, through the funeral, through everything. I placed it on the table, worn brass, slightly dark at the edges where it had been handled for decades. The teeth still sharp enough to cut, even if the lock it was cut for no longer existed. Gerald looked at it for a moment. He said the key was consistent with the original building access records from the co-op's management files, records that documented my name on the apartment's authorized entry list from the time I was an adult, a list that had been quietly updated without my knowledge, without my consent, without anyone notifying me that my name had been removed. I put the key back in my purse. 2 days later, I was given access to the apartment to begin documenting Richard's personal belongings. The rooms were familiar and wrong at the same time. Things had been moved, the kitchen organized in a way my father never would have chosen, his chair facing a different direction. I found myself standing at his desk. Old mahogany. He'd had it since before I was born. It smelled like him. Wood polish and old paper and something I couldn't name that was simply his. I opened the bottom drawer. Underneath a folder of old utility statements and a broken watch he'd always meant to fix, there was a small brass key, identical to mine. Tied with a piece of string to a sealed white envelope, my name was written on the front, in his handwriting. The careful architectural print he'd used his whole life. I stood at my father's desk for a long time before I opened it. His handwriting on the envelope was enough to undo me for a moment. That careful architectural print. He had always written like a man who believed letters deserved to be formed properly. I sat down in his chair. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. Not a legal document, not instructions, just his handwriting, in the unhurried way he wrote when he wasn't in a hurry. Monica. I know my memory is giving me trouble, some days more than others. I want to write this while I'm still myself enough to mean it. If I ever forget things, and I think I probably will, don't believe for 1 second that I forgot you. The nurses, the paperwork. Every Tuesday for years I saw all of it. I want you to know I saw it. You are my daughter. That's not something a person forgets. That's something a person is. Keep the key. It's still yours. Dad. Tied to the envelope by a piece of string was a second brass key. A duplicate of mine. Cut from the same original, worn the same way at the edges. He had kept one. All that time, through the lock change, through the canceled visits, through the months when I had started to wonder if perhaps his silence meant something I didn't want to name, he had kept a copy. He had written the note before the confusion took hold, and then he had put it somewhere he trusted. Somewhere she wouldn't think to look. The deposition was held in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown. Long table, gray chairs, windows facing north. The kind of room that's built for facts, not feelings. Vanessa arrived with her attorney. She was composed. She wore a dark blazer and small pearl earrings, and she sat with her hands folded in a way that communicated patience. She had been composing herself for this for months. Her position was consistent throughout. Richard had made his decisions independently. He had been of sound mind. Monica had been largely absent during the final years of his life, and Richard's choices reflected that reality. She said it all calmly, without hesitation. Then the opposing attorney began presenting the record, Richard's medical evaluations, the dates, the assessments, the documented progression of cognitive decline, placed alongside the estate restructuring timeline. The trust amendments signed during periods when Richard could not reliably recall the day of the week. The financial transfers, itemized, totaling nearly $400,000 labeled as caregiving reimbursements, most directed to an account belonging to Vanessa's son. The building's digital access log, my timestamps, my denied entries. The dates when I had arrived at that building on the same days Vanessa had told neighbors I wasn't coming. The original 2007 will, naming me as beneficiary. Each document placed quietly on the table. No arguments, no raised voices, just paper. Then Gerald placed my father's handwritten note before the room. The attorney asked Vanessa to explain why a man who had allegedly chosen to remove his daughter from his future had written those words, hidden a key, and sealed it with her name on the envelope. She looked at the note. She looked at her attorney. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. She had no answer, not because she hadn't prepared one, because there isn't one. I don't need to describe what came after in detail. The legal process moved the way legal processes do, slowly, then suddenly. The court found sufficient evidence of undue influence and impaired capacity. The later trust was invalidated. The financial transfers were ordered repaid. The apartment remained in the estate, to be distributed according to the original 2007 will. Vanessa did not go to prison. But the reputation she had spent years carefully building, the soft voice, the church friends, the neighbors who called her an angel, did not survive the public record. People who once greeted her warmly in the elevator stopped making eye contact. That was her loss to carry. What I want to tell you is what my father's note actually changed, not the legal outcome. The legal outcome was about documents and dates. The note changed something quieter. Because I had spent months, in the middle of grief, in the middle of everything, quietly afraid that some part of him had believed what she told people, that somewhere in the fog of his illness he had accepted the story she was building, that the man who pressed a brass key into my hand when I was 21 had spent his final years thinking his daughter had simply moved on. He hadn't. He had seen me clearly, for as long as he was able to see anything clearly at all. And when he felt that clarity beginning to slip, he had written it down, hidden it in a drawer, tied it to a key, left it where only someone who actually loved that apartment, who knew that desk, who knew that drawer, would eventually find it. Dementia stole much of the time we should have had. She tried to steal the rest. Neither of them got the same thing. Months after the deposition, I stood outside the building on the Upper West Side. November. Cold enough to see my breath. The brass gate on the elevator visible through the lobby window. In my hand, both keys, his and mine. The restored lock, changed back during the legal process, registered in my name again, waiting on the other side of the door. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. The key turned on the first try. Such a small thing. After everything, the locked doors, the denied entry logs, the months of arriving and being turned away, the lock simply opened, quietly, without ceremony. I stood in the doorway for a moment before going inside. The apartment smelled like itself again. Old wood and radiator warmth and the particular stillness of a room that has been waiting. Someone had opened the windows recently. The building manager perhaps, or Gerald's office handling the logistics, and the November air had moved through and settled. It smelled the way it had always smelled. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that until I was standing inside it. I didn't rush. I walked through the rooms the way you walk through a place when you're not trying to accomplish anything. Just present, just there. The kitchen, where he'd made 2 cups of coffee out of habit after my mother died. The hallway where I used to drop my school bag. The window in the living room that faced west, the one he'd always said had the best afternoon light for reading. His chair was back where it belonged. Someone had moved it during the legal process, returned it to the original position from the photographs on file. It faced the window the way he'd always kept it. I sat in it for a while. Just sat. There are things I understand now that I didn't when this began. I understand that quiet devotion can be rewritten by someone willing to speak loudly enough and stay visible enough and repeat a story often enough that it becomes the one people believe. I understand that the people who love us most are sometimes the ones who assume they don't need to say it, because they think we already know, because they trust that what they've built is permanent, because they can't imagine someone else undoing it. I understand that my father loved me in the way he knew how, steadily, without announcement, through the texture of ordinary days. Paperwork and blueprints and keys pressed into palms, a chair kept facing the right window, a note written while he still could, a key hidden where only someone who truly knew him would find it. I placed his letter on the table beside his photograph. The photograph is one I'd always kept. The 2 of us at my nursing school graduation, him in a jacket he pressed himself because he believed occasions deserved that kind of effort. He's smiling in that quiet way of his, proud without making a fuss of it. The letter sits open beside it now, not because I need to read it anymore, because it belongs there. Because it is part of who he was, and that part of him deserves to be in the light. The brass key I placed beside the letter, both of them, mine, and the duplicate he'd kept. They've been on the same keyring since the day I found them tied together in his desk drawer, and that's where they'll stay, not because I need 2 keys to the same door. Because separating them now would feel like undoing something he'd meant to say. He kept his copy all those years. Through the lock change, through the fog of illness, through everything Vanessa built around him, he kept it in that drawer, tied to that envelope, with my name on the front. That wasn't an accident. That was a man who knew, even when he couldn't hold on to everything, what he was not willing to let go. I want to say something to you, if I can. If you have someone in your life who loves you quietly, who shows up without announcing it, who handles the difficult things without asking for credit, who simply stays, I hope you know how rare that is. And if you've ever been the one doing the staying, the showing up, the quiet work that nobody names, I hope you know it was seen, even when it looked like it wasn't. The people who truly love you may not always have the chance to defend themselves. Sometimes they leave behind just enough truth for you to finally do it for them. I locked the door when I left, turned the key in the lock, heard the mechanism settle, stood in the hallway for a moment. The old wood smell, the familiar light from the window at the end of the corridor, the same crack in the plaster I'd known since childhood. The building superintendent was coming out of the utility room at the far end of the hall. He stopped when he saw me. I held up the key. He nodded once. Slow. The way you nod when something has finally been made right after a long time wrong. Then he went back to his work. I took the elevator down, the brass gate, the lobby, the street outside, cold and bright and ordinary. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew what was behind me. And I finally knew, for certain, completely, without any remaining doubt, that I had never been forgotten. Not once, not ever.